critic accuses Fulani herdsmen and kidnappers of systematically taking over communities in Enugu state, especially Nsukka and surrounding areas, with no meaningful response from the Nigerian government or local political leaders. He criticizes the Enugu state governor for focusing on efforts to discredit Seaman Ekpa internationally, while ignoring the worsening security situation caused by armed Fulani groups. He alleges that towns like Ehamufu and specifically the Yamu area have been overtaken by Fulani militants, forcing indigenous residents to flee while the invaders advance into more urban centers. The critic expresses frustration that neither federal nor state authorities, including governors, senators, or prominent political figures, have publicly addressed the escalating violence and displacement. He recounts a specific incident on April 19, 2025, in Obi Udenu local government area, where a traditional priestess and several others were kidnapped during a ritual journey. The abductors demanded N15 million per victim for release. The situation is said to be especially dire in areas like Isi Uzo, where displaced residents have not returned due to continued Fulani occupation and government inaction. The critic cites Senator Oki Ezia of Enugu North Senatorial District, who confirmed that Fulani terrorists and kidnappers have taken over the entire zone, including Nsukka, which is considered the heart of the Igbo nation. He highlights another kidnapping incident on April 12, 2025 in Ibagwa Ani, where 13 people, including Maurice Osmond and his children, were abducted, with the kidnappers demanding N10 million per person. The critic dismisses calls for more police or military intervention, claiming these forces are either complicit, corrupt, or afraid to act, as seen in cases where communities reported suspicious movements but received no immediate help. He concludes by warning that the southeast is under siege, the government is either incapable or unwilling to act, and the people may need to consider self-defense as insecurity worsens across the region. I have been following the security challenges in Enugu state with growing concern, and I want to share with you what is unfolding on the ground in a way that feels like we are sitting together over a cup of tea, talking through each twist and turn. In recent months, communities in Enugu state have faced an alarming rise in violence that seems to come straight out of a nightmare. Fulani herdsmen, armed kidnappers and militants moving through towns with impunity, displacing families and leaving a trail of fear behind them. What strikes me most is how this crisis has unfolded almost in plain sight, while the political class appears more focused on other agendas. I find myself asking whether our leaders, from the presidency down to our local government chairman, truly understand the depth of the suffering or feel any urgency to act before it is too late. When I think back to how this situation started to spiral out of control, I recall meeting an elderly trader in Nsukka market who, only a few months ago, was brimming with hope for the future. He told me then that he worried about the steady flow of armed herdsmen moving through nearby villages. He described how the arrival of cattle herders often brought a subtle tension, grazing routes that cut through farmlands, livestock trampling crops, and disputes over land rights. Over time, those disputes did not simply remain verbal confrontations. Instead, they mutated into violent clashes, with the herders arriving well-armed, sometimes in groups that outnumbered the local vigilantes. Before long, the local farmers and indigenous residents found themselves at a disadvantage, unable to match the firepower of those who claimed grazing rights. It was in that moment, sitting in that busy market stall surrounded by the scent of fresh yams and tomatoes, that the seeds of what we now witness were clearly sown. As the months rolled on, the scale of the threat grew. I received messages from friends in Ehamufu, one of the towns that border the Uzo Uwani area, describing scenes that felt more like war zones than rural villages. They spoke of patrols of armed men in military-style uniforms, Fulani militants, they believed, who moved drove through the streets with large-caliber firearms, stopping residents at checkpoints to inspect identity documents and seek out anyone they deemed unsympathetic. One young teacher told me how she and her colleagues grew anxious every time they walked to school, fearing that they might be rounded up or worse. She confided that on more than one occasion she hid in the bushy fringes outside her community to avoid being intercepted. Hearing her voice crack with fear, I felt the weight of a community under siege. On April 19, 2025, the situation erupted into a particularly harrowing episode in Obe in Udanu local government area. A traditional priestess, whose full name I will not omit out of respect, Madam Grace Ifeoma Nwankwo, and 7 others were on their way to a riverside sacred site for a ritual offering when they were ambushed. I remember when I first heard the news, it was early in the morning, and I was already checking my phone for updates. Reports said that suspected kidnappers overwhelmed their small convoy, seizing each person and spiriting them away into the thick forest that fringes the Afurauku Hills. For the families, the ransom demand was a staggering 15 million naira per person, an amount that is almost unimaginable for most households in Enugu state. I rang a relative who lives in the neighboring community of Nsukka, and she told me that families were mortgaging whatever they had, jewelry, land deeds, even the future earnings of their children, to raise enough money for the release of loved ones. It struck me how quickly hope can turn into desperation when lawlessness takes hold. What makes this crisis all the more painful is the silence, or rather the distraction, of those meant to safeguard public welfare. I noted with incredulity how Governor Peter Ndubuisi Mba of Enugu State appeared more invested in an international effort to discredit Mr. Simon Ekpa, the Finnish-based activist who advocates for the restoration of the Republic of Biafra. I have read the dispatches sent to Helsinki, and it seems that the state machinery was bent on painting Mr. Simon Ekpa as a destabilizing force within the state, using diplomatic cables and legal briefs as weapons. Meanwhile, the communities that lie at the heart of the Igbo nation, places like Nsukka, Ehamufu, and Uzo Uwani, were left to fend for themselves. I wonder whether the elaborate campaign against Mr. Simon Ekpa absorbed all the bandwidth of the governor's office to the point where insecurity was considered a secondary concern. That sense of neglect was echoed by Senator Oki Ezia, who represents Enugu North Senatorial District. When he spoke publicly, he did not mince words. He laid bare the reality that Fulani militants and kidnappers have effectively taken over the entire senatorial zone, including the federal government-owned University of Nigeria in Nsukka, which has long been a symbol of academic excellence in the region. He described how students and lecturers now travel only in convoys, how campus activities are curtailed by curfews, and how research projects at the university have ground to a halt because fieldwork in surrounding villages has become too dangerous. Listening to his statement, I felt a deep sadness. This was not a senator seeking headlines, but a man sounding an alarm about a crisis so severe that it threatened not only human lives, but the intellectual soul of an entire region. Just a week before the Obe kidnapping, on April 12, 2025, another tragic incident unfolded in the Ibagwa Ani community of Igbo Etiti local government area. 13 individuals, among them a British-Nigerian visiting scholar named Mr. Morris Osmond and his 2 young children, were abducted while en route to a family gathering. They were reportedly traveling along the dusty road that links Ibagwa Ani to the in-laws of Mr. Morris Osmond, planning a modest celebration in honor of his son's transition exam into St. John's Secondary School. I recall the images shared on social media, the empty car seats, the overturned roadside basket of yams, and the terrified looks of locals who had witnessed the abduction from a distance. The ransom demand in this case was 10 million naira per person, a sum that, while slightly lower than the demand for Madam Grace Ifeoma Nwankwo and her companions, still represented a crippling financial burden for ordinary families. The cries for increased police and military presence that followed these incidents fell on deaf ears. Communities reported suspicious movements by armed groups to local police stations, only to be told that reinforcements would arrive in 24 or 48 hours. In one case, vigilantes in Isi-Uzo local government area said that they alerted the Nigeria Police Force headquarters in Enugu city when they saw 2 pickup trucks loaded with armed men heading toward their village. Days passed before a patrol was dispatched, by which time the invaders had moved on with looted motorcycles and farm produce. I spoke with a coordinator of a grassroots defense group who told me in hushed tones that he believed some officers were colluding with the herders, receiving bribes to turn a blind eye. He confessed that the defunct Department of State Services seemed more interested in surveilling local activists than targeting the actual perpetrators of violence. That feeling of betrayal was deeply personal when I met young mothers in the Isi-Uzo displacement camp. They told me about the day that Fulani herdsmen used burning tires to block the only road connecting their village to the local hospital. They had just given birth or were nursing sick children, and they could not reach medical care for days. One woman, Mrs. Kioma Nwanyanwu, described how she held her newborn inside a mosquito net in a makeshift shelter, listening to gunshots in the distance. I found myself holding her hand, unable to promise safety, but hoping that our shared humanity would at least offer some comfort. It was in that moment that I realized how disillusioned citizens can become when they lose faith in the very government that is supposed to protect them. Some argue that more policing or military deployment is the obvious solution. Yet the very institutions charged with public safety have shown themselves either powerless or unwilling to uphold their duties. In Benue State earlier this year, similar tactics of intimidation and takeovers were met with heavy-handed military responses that sometimes inflicted collateral damage on innocent civilians. Here in Enugu State, there is a belief among locals that officers are more afraid of the powerful herders than they are of the armed civilians trying to defend their land. The term Fulani terrorists has entered everyday speech, a stark contrast to the earlier, more benign references to pastoralists. And when the Department of State Services Director recently visited Enugu, he was quick to warn community defense groups to disband, arguing that only the federal security apparatus could restore order. That directive felt hollow to people who have seen no evidence of an effective federal response. I cannot help but think about the historical context of this situation. The Enugu area has long been a crucible for the movements of people and ideas. It was here, in 1966 and 1967, that tensions over governance and identity erupted into the civil war that created the Biafran Republic. The memory of those years, scarcity of food, breakdown of social order, mass displacement, still lingers in the collective consciousness of the region. When I speak with elders who lived through the events of 50 years ago, their faces tighten as they talk about hunger and the sound of aircraft overhead. Now, when I ask them whether they see any difference between the siege of Biafra and the current wave of attacks by armed herdsmen and kidnappers, their silence speaks volumes. They fear that the lessons of history are being forgotten and that a new generation may suffer the same agony. Many young people, meanwhile, have turned to social media to document their experiences. Hashtags like @SaveEnugu and Enugu Under Siege trend intermittently, but they rarely lead to concrete action. Instead, videos circulate showing burned buildings in the Yamu area, where entire neighborhoods were abandoned overnight. I watched one clip that showed a row of houses with doors ajar, children's shoes scattered on the floor, and goats roaming freely in the courtyard. A voiceover explained that the indigenous residents fled with whatever they could grab, leaving behind memories and livelihoods. It was impossible not to imagine the trauma of those families as they faced both the loss of home and the uncertainty of displacement. In the political arena, some have tried to frame this crisis as a dispute over grazing laws or a fallout of clashing economic interests. Others insist it is a carefully orchestrated campaign by foreign mercenaries disguised as herdsmen. I have listened to scholars at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, debate the matter, but their conferences feel detached from the lived reality of people whose lives have been upended. I spoke with a lecturer in political science who argued that the Enugu state government's focus on Mr. Simon Ekpa's activities abroad was a deliberate distraction. She suggested that high-profile legal actions against Mr. Simon Ekpa were meant to project an image of decisive leadership, while in reality, the state's security apparatus was too frail or compromised to deal with the more immediate threat. Her words resonated with me. It felt like watching a magician's sleight of hand, drawing attention to one card while the real trick unfolds elsewhere. Throughout all of this, I have found solace in the small acts of kindness and solidarity among neighbors. In Nsukka, a group of farmers pooled resources to hire private security patrols for their community. In Uwani, an association of retired teachers opened a shelter for displaced families, providing food and medical care with donations they collected on social media. These grassroots efforts, while admirable, are stopgap measures that cannot replace a comprehensive strategy from the state and federal government. I think of these volunteers as the true frontline responders, while the formal institutions remain in the wings, waiting to see if the crisis will fizzle out or explode further. As I reflect on the broader implications of this unfolding tragedy, I recognize that Enugu state is just one theater in a much larger struggle over land, identity, and political power in Nigeria. The Middle Belt region has seen decades of conflict between pastoralists and farmers, often inflamed by unclear land tenure laws and inadequate policing. In some places, cattle grazing routes have been officially demarcated, but enforcement is lax and corruption pervasive. Meanwhile, armed groups with varying motives, from insurgent movements to criminal gangs, have learned to exploit these grey areas, moving under the cover of traditional herders. I fear that unless a multidimensional approach is taken, one that addresses land use policy, security sector reform, community reconciliation, and economic empowerment, the cycle of violence will only deepen. There is also the question of national leadership. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu and the federal government have faced criticism for their handling of security across the country, from the banditry in the northwest to the insurgency in the northeast. In Enugu state, the local political class seems content to pass responsibility upwards or sideways, blaming federal agencies for inaction while directing their energies towards partisan battles. This environment breeds cynicism among citizens, who may begin to believe that only self-help remains. The danger here is that self-help can morph into vigilantism or ethnic militias, further fracturing the social cohesion we so desperately need. I cannot conclude without acknowledging the human cost of this crisis. Behind every statistic is a face, a mother searching for her child, a student missing classes, an elder who cannot return to the ancestral land that holds the graves of his parents. I have met these people, heard their stories, felt their tears. Their dreams, their hopes, their simple desire for safety and dignity remind me that governance is not just an abstract exercise in power, but a fundamental pact between rulers and the ruled. When that pact is broken, the consequences are borne by those least able to defend themselves. For my part, I intend to keep sharing these stories, to keep the conversation alive, and to urge action at every level. I believe that if enough of us, journalists, activists, scholars, and ordinary citizens, press for accountability, the voices of the displaced and the vulnerable can no longer be ignored. I am convinced sense that security is not a luxury, but a right, and that when people feel protected, they can build the communities and the economy that we all aspire to. Enugu State, with its rich culture, its resilient people, and its storied history, deserves leadership that recognizes this truth and acts upon it with urgency and compassion. Until then, I will continue to listen, to learn, and to lend my voice to those who feel they have no other recourse. It is my hope that together we can turn the tide, that we can remind our leaders of their solemn duty, and that we can restore peace to the towns and villages that lie under siege. I invite you to join me in holding our government to account, in supporting the communities in distress, and in affirming that security, justice, and human dignity are the bedrock of any thriving society. This is the end of our news update. Please click the icon on the top right corner of your screen to watch my next video. You will enjoy it. I will see you again in my next update. Enjoy the rest of your day.